Haidong. In this video, we're going to talk about fluidity. Fluidity is one of those ideas that, again, most martial artists at least think about at some point, whether or not they're teaching it, whether or not they're receiving information about it. But it's one of those things that it seems to mean different things to many different people, which is fine. So I know I'd like to, pretend I am like the grand authority, but the fact of the matter is, like, there are many different ways to interpret fluidity. However, there is a way that I personally like to interpret fluidity that I think is less harmful to you as a swordsman and as a martial artist in general. So if I were to ask you, as you're going through your forms, like, okay, like, work on your fluidity, and I just walk away like a great instructor would, what would you probably do to work on your fluidity? So the grand majority of people would be like, all right, I'll go a little bit slowly, like I'm not gonna add any power to it, I'm just gonna be vibing, I'm just gonna go through the movements and just have some fun with it. Like, okay, so yes, you can get a sort of fluidity from that, but is that fluidity necessarily gonna help you engage with actual, sword fighting and, using a heavier weapon? No. So the short answer is going to be no, or the returns on are going to be diminishing very, very quickly. Now that said, there are really good things for you to consider if you are going through a form slowly and without power. So noticing like what muscle groups you do engage, for example, is a good way to learn information from going through a form slowly. But let's talk about another aspect of fluidity that I think is going to be more helpful to not just us as swordsmen, but also us as martial artists, us as people who are in motion. I'm going to take a combination from one of my favorite forms, right? So Sangsu 6, and I'll just do it a few different ways. Hopefully it's going to show a little bit of what I mean, right? So I'm going to just take a portion because I don't want to get in trouble with the Federation. So let's just take the very end, right? So if we're here, and we do our happy ending here, right? So, okay, right? Like you probably weren't like watching. It's like, yes, this is swordsmanship in action, right? That's like, okay, you're dancing, right? It's like, oh, wee, right? And it's kind of like, this is fun, super fluid. Okay. Now, if I try to do that same thing sped up, or not even sped up, but adding a little bit more power, things are going to get away from the wall a little bit. Things are going to look really bad, right? So if I try to have that same mechanic as I move, it's going to be very bad, right? So like, things get really weird really quickly. It's not good. So what I recommend, so when you think about fluidity, what I would invite you to do is not necessarily think about merely doing it without power, but without added power, if that makes sense. So from a engineering, right, because I went to college for something. So from like an engineering perspective, think of it as a closed system, right? So as you go through a form, all of your action, all of your kinetic energy, I want you to turn back into potential energy in your body. That does not make sense right now. I'm aware of that, but that's what I mean. So when you go through a fluidity drill, think of it that way, as opposed to when you do it in actuality, when you're actually using your sword for combat, for forms, whatever you're using it for. You're going to be adding some extra power. So it's not necessarily a closed system, you're adding a little bit extra power to each of the movements. So let's go through that same combination again, right? So now instead of merely being like, wee, right? Where like everything's just like loosey-goosey here, right? Where again, nothing's being added, but nothing's being stored either, if that makes sense. Doing this kind of stuff is just keeping the kinetic energy moving as opposed to kinetic energy, potential energy, kinetic energy, potential energy. This is what I mean. So I'll go a little bit closer to you here. So as I am doing my false edge, so that stab using, again, the back of the tip to really dig into someone's rib or temple, wherever you're going. So from here, instead of just being like, right, think about your kinetic and potential energy. So think about, for me, when I'm doing that, kind of shifting my weight into like this pack here. So as I'm shifting my weight, that very smooth transition, I'm going to use the bigger muscle groups that have a stored potential energy and use that to move my weapon and move my limbs, right? Limbs and weapon, but you get what I mean. So from here, so let's in the form I'm here, as I'm shifting, I'm keeping my, my thigh relatively tense here as I shift. As I shift this energy to here, right? Notice I'm going to naturally want to move my weapon, right? So if I'm here, shift, feel that transition, use that transition, noticing I'm going to dig up a little bit on the hip here to help the blade come back up from down below, and using all of that here. You can also see that hip shift at the end to really help you snap that out, right? Potential energy here, shift this way as we pull into a half potato, here. From here, as I'm actually going to face you as I do this, as I finish my cut here, I'm going to feel it in here as it kind of opens up, feel in the back of my shoulder. I'm going to use that energy to pop it back in here, right? And from here, I'm going to use the front of the shoulder to push through my block here, right? To really throw that blade forward. So it's not wrist, it's here. As I'm shouldering, almost like I'm battering ram something here, shoulder underneath, that's going to cause everything else to wrap around. And as I cut, I'm going to use the momentum here, once it passes my toes, forward, and then letting that momentum kick it off. Here, just holding it, noticing I'm going to use it in my side of my leg here. As I push my body forward, noticing I'm going to be using, so deep shoulder, elbow here. Think about pulling the weapon forward into a guard. Into a guard. And I'm going to focus, finger over, using the natural weight of the weapon to bring it over here. So as opposed to a right? Here, just. Now I know that was really specific to this one particular combination, but that's the idea that I want you to think about, right? So notice if I do this combination without me explaining it, working on the closed system, very different from what I did the first time, right? So it's not a constant motion. The acceleration is not zero. We do have acceleration, right? And we're using that acceleration based on my body motion alone to really get that extra oomph. So what I mean by the difference between fluidity and having your more like standard form, for example, is you're going to be engaging not only your core group, you're going to be engaging some of your forearms, you're going to be engaging biceps, engaging some parts of the sides here. So when you actually go through this combination in full, right, I'm going to strike and cut up, forward, and away. It's going to be able to get, so I'm not adding any extra strain to the body, right, because the fluidity is showing me how the muscle group should be shifting, but it's going to give me a little bit more power as I add a little bit more of the other muscle groups involved. Hopefully that makes sense. Let me show you another combination just to kind of give you another perspective, right? So again, I'm a little bit biased on that one particular portion. It is a portion you see quite a lot of in Gumdo practitioners, right? So especially a lot of us draw our jingum with that combination before we do some bamboo cutting, for example. But this is not obviously the only combination you can work with this concept, right? So let me take a little bit of Sangsu 7 as well, so another one of my favorites, right? It's almost like I have too many favorites. But, so let me show you I won't say mere fluidity, but the first version of fluidity, which is just the lack of power, acceleration close to zero. I mean zero because there's going back and forth, but you get the idea. So hopefully my physics friends will be like, here, let's take a look at the combination. So merely without power, right? So no acceleration. Going back, strike, strike, block, up, bun, 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 up. Okay. Again, if I try to do that faster or adding some more power, that like loosey-goosey kind of stuff here is gonna go crazy, right? Just like things don't look good at all. Versus, again, going back. So again, think about where you're storing your energy and how you're able to shift that energy effectively into the blade, right? So even just going back here, right? So as I'm striking forward, I'm gonna let the weight shift back into my glute, right? As I'm shifting back my bomse, as it comes forward here, this is gonna be extending, almost like a spring reaching the end before you pull it back. Here, using the left hand to let you guide back, use the tip to drop back as you go. Shift from left glute to right glute. As I pull it back, strike. Again, using kiken daichi, so that synchrony. Using that hip to absorb, so parrying their sword up, pushing myself through using your diaphragm, pushing yourself through for big ol' cut, looking to the corner. So shifting from this, so you're going to push forward into a sotose as I start to wrap my hands around, up, and back. So let me try that again without my explaining. So from here, right, so, and the same thing with a little more power, right? So no longer closed system, adding some power to it, right? So I hope that makes sense. So I know I gave a few examples. This is an idea that's really hard to like express, which is kind of understandable why it's not taught as often. But this is what I want you to think about as you think about fluidity. So fluidity is going to be really important to you. So not because it's going to be like gentle, right? But because it's going to let you learn how to shift that momentum, how to shift the kinetic into potential energy into your body without damaging your body, right? Because when we train with a heavier weapon, so again, this is a steel sword, so I love using my steel swords. As you use a steel sword and you use, again, heavier and heavier weapons, especially as you're doing bamboo cutting and you're doing like demonstrations and stuff like that, you really need to make sure you're thinking about how your muscle groups are really engaging with your weapon. So as opposed to like, looking pretty for a flourish, you really want to make sure you have that fluidity. So I guess with that, so make sure you do this safely, right? So obviously go through this slowly. You can still do the two combinations I did quite slowly, right? You can do it quite slowly, really feel where your body is naturally absorbing. If you don't feel yourself absorbing at all, a good place to just think like, okay, like his main obsession is like glutes and core. It's like, okay, I don't feel anything. Let me try to engage my back glute, maybe in my stance. Oh, that's drawing my, my momentum this way. Maybe I can use that. So when in doubt, just think about where your glutes are activated, if your core is activated. Now, if you feel that a smaller muscle group, so for example, like the side of the calf, for example, or forearm or your neck or something like that, or even parts of your pectoral, that is probably a sign that you're doing something not wrong per se, but something that's not efficient. So fluidity is about efficiency. So with that, make sure you do so safely. So stay safe, stay humble, and keep training. Haidong.